Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Working in Government, Creative Solutions to Political Constraints. Our session today is sponsored by the Committee for Government Historians, and all of us on this panel are members of that committee. And we encourage anyone who's working in government to join our committee or, reach out to us to get more information about the work that we're doing. We invite participants. Today, we're going to be talking about the unique challenges that we face working in government. We often find that we're dealing with issues very different than others working in public history. And so we're going to explore some of these challenges today. Our panel today consists of myself, who will be serving as your facilitator. I'm Christine Ridarsky. I'm the officially appointed government historian for the city of Rochester, New York. I also serve as Director of Historical Services for the Central Library of Rochester and Monroe County. I have undergraduate degrees in communications and political science, a master's degree in American history from the State University of New York College at Brockport, and I'm ABD toward a PhD in American history at the University of Rochester. My primary research areas are in women's history and social movements, but as a government historian, I do a little bit of everything, as most of us do. I also serve as the current president of the Association of Public Historians of New York State. Also joining us is Rebekah Dobrasko. Rebekah lives in Austin, Texas, and is an environmental program manager and lead historian at the Texas Department of Transportation. She is currently project managing TxDOT's Historic Bridge Program and the Beyond the Road Public Outreach Campaign. She holds a master's degree in public history from the University of South Carolina and an undergraduate degree in history from Tulane University in New Orleans. Prior to joining TxDOT in 2013, Rebekah worked at the South Carolina State Historic Preservation Office in Columbia, South Carolina. She was there for 10 years, and during that time, she served as the supervisor for compliance, tax incentives, and survey, and as the state tax credit program coordinator. Rebekah is co-chair of the NCPH Committee for Government Historians. Next, we have Jim Bertolini. Jim is a historic preservation planner in the city of Fort Collins, Colorado. He works within the Department of Community Development and Neighborhood Services. Jim is passionate about exploring the relationship between historic preservation and sustainable communities. He holds undergraduate and graduate degrees in history from Colorado State University, specializing in public history and historic preservation. Prior to working for the city of Fort Collins, he worked for the National Park Service as the historic preservation specialist for Aurora, Colorado, and on community-focused and research programs with the Nevada State Historic Preservation Office in Carson City. Kate Scott is an associate historian in the U.S. Senate Historical Office. She received her PhD in American history from Temple University in Philadelphia. Her research includes women in politics, congressional oversight and investigations, executive legislative relations, and U.S. foreign policy. She is currently editing the executive sessions of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee from 1969 to 1975 and conducting oral histories to document change in the Senate over time. She is the author of Reigning in the State, Civil Society and Congress in the Vietnam and Watergate eras, published in 2013, as well as numerous articles, essays, and chapters relating to U.S. political history. Next, we have Jean-Pierre Morin. He is the departmental historian for the Department of Crown-Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada and Indigenous Services Canada, where he specializes in the history of government policy and administration of Indigenous and Northern affairs, as well as treaties. He is also an adjunct research professor for public history in the history department at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. Finally, we have Michael Binder. Michael is a non-traditional historian with degrees in chemistry and geology and early career experience as an analytical chemist and oil company research geologist. His studies on the history of the Cold War military installations began as a hobby nearly 40 years ago. For 10 years, he was an independent military history consultant focusing on CRM and environmental assessment projects on Air Force, Army, and Navy installations across the US. He then transitioned into the federal government, first as a contract document reviewer with the Department of Energy, and now as technical advisor with the Air Force Declassification Office, operating out of the National Archives at College Park, Maryland. His job functions focus on the classification and declassification of Air Force records and on training other document reviewers in the protection of classified Air Force and nuclear weapons information. For today's session, each of our panelists has prepared a brief case study to demonstrate the variety of work that we do as historians working in government and the unique challenges that we face. Once they have presented, I have a series of questions for the panelists to address. This session was originally envisioned as a structured conversation to encourage you, the audience, to engage in dialogue with us and with each other. That may be a little more difficult in this webinar setup that we are using, but we will still hope that you will engage in dialogue with us by using the Q&A feature to comment, ask questions, and share some of your own experiences. I will be monitoring the chat throughout the session and will read as many of them as I can before we conclude the session. Kate, can you go to the next slide, please? So as the facilitator, I did not prepare a full case study like my colleagues have, but I thought I would get us started by giving you a brief overview of the project that really got me thinking deeply about the particular challenges that we face as government historians and the creative ways in which we often need to find to navigate those challenges. Next slide, please. The biggest challenge of my career began about 4 years ago when the city of Rochester, New York, where I work, began contemplating a plan to redevelop our downtown riverfront. And one of the main proposals involved drastically altering the most iconic landmark in our community. It's a structure that you see in the upper left-hand corner of this slide here as it looks today. It's a structure that we know alternatively as the aqueduct, the subway tunnel, or the Broad Street Bridge. This is a structure that had roots in the Erie Canal days of New York. It was built as an aqueduct to carry the Erie Canal over the Genesee River. But when the canal was rerouted out of Rochester in the early 20th century, and this portion of the canal was abandoned, a second layer was built on top of the canal. And you start to see that in this image at the top right. That second structure created a tunnel to be used for a new subway system that ran through Rochester. And then ultimately a third layer was added, a decking that turned the structure into an automobile bridge and roadway as well. The subway was abandoned in the mid-20th century, and therefore the tunnel was abandoned and became a site for a variety of underground activities. It provided shelter for people without homes. It provided a space for people to gather for underground get-togethers, parties, and concerts. And finally, it turned into something of an underground graffiti gallery. We have painters who come from all over the world to paint in this space. And it's become a space where people can practice their art without marring the surfaces above ground, so to speak. And so it has been quite well known among our community. And I believe that it's one of the reasons that we have such a vibrant mural arts community in Rochester with many sanctioned above ground projects in the community. Unfortunately, the city's plan for this structure involves tearing off the top levels of this. Planners have decided to prioritize the very first use of the structure as the Erie Canal Aqueduct and remove everything that was built or used post-1920s. This was something that I found difficult as a historian to accept without context, but I couldn't exactly challenge our planners and my mayor. So I had to be creative in ensuring that these additional layers of history were not lost. And so the way that I and colleagues have had to approach this was through an educational campaign that didn't directly challenge the project proposed by the city, but that sought to educate the public and the planners as well. Ultimately, I don't expect that we'll change any of the plans, but we expect that there will be robust interpretation built into the plan so that we can continue to share these stories with the public. So that is my story, and that is, part of the reason I wanted to gather this group together today to think about the ways that we can address difficult situations in our community. And with that, I will turn it over to Rebekah.
Good morning/afternoon, everybody. I'm excited to be here today and have a case study prepared that I'm supposed to present in 8 minutes. So I'm going to race through everything because I love to talk. I am a historian that works for the Texas Department of Transportation. And basically what I do is that I assist TxDOT to comply with federal and state historic preservation laws, most notably Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. For those who don't know, Section 106, it requires a federal agency, in this case TxDOT, because we use federal funds or we need federal permits to do our transportation activities. So it requires federal agencies to consider the effects of their projects on historic properties, which are those listed in or eligible for listing in our National Register of Historic Places. We must consider those effects in consultation with a host of agencies, organizations, and the public. And then if we have adverse effects on historic properties, we must mitigate for the loss of those historic properties. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to talk about a project that we did, the Border West Expressway in El Paso, Texas, which is in far west Texas on the border with Mexico. Next slide, please. So here we are thrown in. The map of Border West Expressway is supposed to serve as an alternative route to and from downtown El Paso that doesn't involve Interstate 10. So it's the brownish yellow route on this map. You can see that TxDOT designers had to thread the new roadway between the international border, existing neighborhoods and roads, the Rio Grande, and the border wall. TxDOT ultimately needed a permit from the Federal International Boundary and Water Commission, which regulates the Rio Grande, the water flow, and other boundary issues to build a portion of our project. The permit area for work in the international boundary was adjacent to Chihuahua, a local historic district. Next slide, please. So Chihuahua is here in the bend of the river. It's known as Chihuahua means Little Chihuahua, which is after the bordering Mexico state of Juarez. And I want you to note a few things. There's a few blocks of the neighborhood highlighted with the red arrow. Just to the north of it is a huge rail yard and railroad tracks. Just to the south of it is the Rio Grande River. Also the new Border West Expressway, you can see here, SH 375. To the east of the neighborhood is a bridge to Mexico. And this includes a huge pedestrian crossing over, so it's very highly used. You can also see the mark of the Greyhound bus station. And really that there's only one way in and out of this neighborhood along South Santa Fe Street that crosses over the railroad tracks as well. Next slide, please. Here's a close-up of the little historic district that is there. I also, so all the way over to the right of the map, you can see Santa Fe. That's the street that leads over into Mexico with the pedestrian bridge. You can also see just to the south of it and north of the Rio Grande, there's a notation called the Franklin Canal. That is an irrigation canal, which is over 100 years old and historically significant in its own right. So that is the location of where we needed to try to put this new expressway. Next slide, please. Sorry for the fuzzy quality of this, but I think you can get the gist of the picture. Chihuahua is one of the earliest neighborhoods in El Paso. it was a typical starting point for Mexican immigrants or workers coming in to Texas. The neighborhood is a pretty small neighborhood, but it's filled with one-story adobe buildings. Adobe is a very traditional building material made out of mud and straw and baked in the sun. And so these are some pretty old buildings that have very traditional materials as well as traditional design. Many of these buildings have been in the same family for generations. The neighborhood is mostly Spanish speaking, and it has undergone years of discrimination, disinvestment, and impacts, many of which I highlighted on the maps from different federal, state, and local governments. Next slide, please. But despite all of that, the neighborhood still persists. The neighborhood worked to get recognition as a local historic district from the city of El Paso. They built a neighborhood community center, which is seen here in the photograph with the train on the building, and they built a park. And you can also see in the background of this, there's mountains that say Juarez on them, so you can see Mexico from here. And so when TxDOT came for the proposal for the Border West Expressway, at first we planned to demolish a lot of the neighborhood. But after years of advocacy, TxDOT changed the design to what we call an elevated expressway. And that's what you see towering over the neighborhood at the top of this picture. We needed to build that elevated expressway in the lands controlled by the International Boundary and Water Commission, and thus we needed a federal permit. Under Section 106, we all determined this project adversely affects the neighborhood because of this huge visual intrusion of this massive highway looming over the neighborhood, which also added more noise and more light than was prior there. Next slide, please. So under Section 106, we had to mitigate for those adverse impacts or compensate for the damage that we were doing to the neighborhood of Chihuahua. At first, TxDOT decided to develop 3 posters with images of Chihuahua, historic images both on the front and then text and classroom activities on the back. The posters were to be used in classrooms and then used in curriculum. However, there were some problems. Number one, we didn't ask teachers if they want posters or if they want curriculum. Number two, we didn't talk to any residents of the neighborhood about what they might want to see for mitigation. The residents of the neighborhood did not have a very good relationship with TxDOT based on the previous plans to demolish portions of the neighborhood. In developing this mitigation, we also contracted with all-white consultant teams out of Austin, which is really kind of a byproduct of how our state does contracting, but still it was an outside team. We had an audience that we had defined in Austin, but we really didn't understand what the audience needed or wanted, and therefore had no way to really distribute the posters because we didn't have any contacts with teachers or schools. And before this project, this was really a typical way that TxDOT's cultural resource team did mitigation. People in Austin determined what we thought the mitigation should be. Next slide, please. But after some personnel changes and some additional thinking about what is going on, we had some lessons learned and we changed what we decided to do. We asked teachers what was necessary. They said, oh, we're not going to use posters. We're not going to really have the curriculum. So we moved away from that and decided that we would meet then with the neighborhood association. The people in the neighborhood were the ones really being impacted. What would they like to see? And so they told us that they wanted information about the neighborhood in Spanish. They wanted us to highlight, yes, some of the challenges of the neighborhood, but also a lot of the successes, that the neighborhood still existed after all of this time, that the residents were really proud of it. And there was a lot of cool stuff to learn about Chihuahua. And we started to reframe this story from a less Anglo historian point of view. So we revised the product to have the neighborhood residents as the main audience. And then kind of a subsidiary audience would be parents with children in El Paso that were maybe interested in learning some local history. Next slide, please. So I am missing a slide here. But anyways, you can go back if you want, Kate. It resulted in a booklet with historic images and quotes from residents, and we printed it both in English and Spanish. It had the emphasis on the neighborhood. We unveiled the booklet here with the neighborhood first, and we celebrated with a potluck in the community center, which was how the neighborhood, you know, came together and celebrated things. And oh my goodness, the food was amazing. Like, I want to go to all their potlucks now. And then the next day we had a community celebration where we partnered with the city library and the El Paso Museum of History to highlight the stories of Chihuahua, to hand out the booklet, to hand out the poster, which you can kind of see on the wall in the back. But if you go, Kate, to the previous slide, the cover of the poster of the booklet over here on the left of this is actually a little poster that goes along with it too. And the whole project led to a new way of TxDOT understanding how we do public involvement and history and setting up public history projects like this. It led us to do a better understanding of our audiences, who they were, what they wanted, and what they needed, and how we could give that to them as opposed to us just thinking about the things that we thought that they needed. So it ended up being a great, successful project. And if you could go to the next slide now. You can find the booklet online if you'd like to see it. I'm going to put it in the chat boxes in both places, a link to it. Or you can contact me if you want to talk about more things. A big thing that came out of this is something that was mentioned in my bio, the Beyond the Road campaign. And it's a big public facing campaign that TxDOT is doing now to try and share the stories of the environmental and history work that we do. And you can see some of what we have planned at our website on keyword Beyond the Road. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rebekah. My name is Jim Bertolini. Again, I'm the historic preservation planner for the city of Fort Collins. So what that means, generally, our office is responsible for attempting to preserve places of significance to the community within city limits in Fort Collins. So Kate, if we could go to the next slide. Just a little bit of background on Fort Collins. We're in northern Colorado, pretty close. We're in Larimer County, which is right next to the border with Wyoming. So we're part of the Front Range community, extending north from Denver. And so the case study I have today is about one of our rapid response histories and how we've responded to really some of the political pressure that emerged from a previous project. And next slide, please. So what this is about is a series of rapid response histories that are in progress right now. These really started as limited history projects early in the pandemic, where we were trying to figure out, we have education as part of our mandate as a public office. How do we do this? And so last year for the Centennial Suffrage, we were rolling out a virtual walking tour of women's suffrage sites. And that included a support for walking tour, the history, a webpage dedicated to that, but also support for a proclamation that was issued by our mayor. And what came out of that, though, especially in response to some of the social movements last spring related to Black Lives Matter, was pressure from our community that those statements be qualified. Because of course the goal was to celebrate the establishment of the 19th Amendment. But it started a conversation, a much broader conversation within city government about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so our office started taking that under advisement. We recognized that while we've done some research, especially for our longstanding and large Mexican-American community that's been here since the 1920s, that we really didn't have a lot of information about any of our community's minorities. We started as a farming town in northern Colorado. That hasn't changed a whole lot. We've expanded into more of a bedroom community for the Denver metro area, as well as the seat of the Colorado State University. But we didn't really have a lot of these stories well told. And there was, in our case, while there weren't political constraints necessarily from our executive leadership telling us to kind of shove these kinds of stories into the rug, quite the opposite. We had a lot of demand, both from executive leadership and the community, to tell these stories. The problem was that the policy conversations were moving quickly, and they were demanding historical context to help with that. And so we had to develop a model to work quickly, which had some successes, but also some lessons learned that I'm going to talk about here in a sec. In this case, we were really focusing on Martin Luther King Day, partnering with Colorado State University's Black and African American Cultural Center, which leads those celebrations here in Fort Collins, on how we can best tell these stories in a quick way. We're not waiting for a large scale context or things like that. What kinds of products and solutions and stories do we need to tell to get something up quickly, but also then to start building trust with areas, with parts of our community that didn't have a lot of trust in city government in particular to acknowledge the history of racism or discrimination in our community, but then also to do something about it. So if we can go to the next slide. What we started developing was a webpage and a virtual tour that has expanded into some online programming about African American history in particular in Fort Collins. And as part of building trust with our community and even with our fellow employees, in telling this story and building enough trust to get people involved, was to acknowledge the history of racism in Fort Collins. We tend to have this image of ourselves as a fairly progressive community, fairly open. And the reality, of course, when you start researching history, like a lot of communities in northern Colorado in the 1920s in particular, we have very strong clan membership. We have documented housing segregation. We have neighborhoods with racial covenants restricting ownership to white individuals. We have Klan rallies. We had a cross burning in our city park in 1925. And so what we found in terms of building trust with people who did not have trust, who we wanted to involve in this education process, was to just acknowledge that history. That's been a big part of operating in this political environment, was to just acknowledge that not only was our community responsible for racism and discrimination in the past, but that we're prepared. In this case, we're providing context so that the city can take action, because the city itself was complicit in some of these actions in the past. We can go to the next slide. Part of our role with the Historic Preservation Office, of course, is we deal with history in place. So we're talking about places that we could either interpret or ideally preserve for the benefit of future residents. A lot of these places, when we're talking about Black history in Fort Collins, are similar to a lot of communities where they're not there anymore. Even when we're talking about the story of like a lot of Western farming communities, there's usually a small group of Black farmers that moved to that community, worked in service industries or owned farms outside of town. In our case, Charlie Clay, who's in the upper left photo, is one of those individuals, was in Fort Collins by 1882 and was pretty well known, lived just north of where City Hall is now. And unfortunately, that home, which you're seeing, it's actually behind the home. We don't have a photograph of his home, but his family ended up moving into the house that you're seeing in the upper center photograph there. But there's a lot of stories of Black history that have basically been demolished and redeveloped, some of them recently, because we didn't know this story. And in some cases because of discrimination. These were areas that were not as well improved. They were next to industrial uses. And so they've been targets of what basically are urban renewal projects since the 1970s. And so part of our trust building exercise in this particular project was to acknowledge that history as well. And especially in this case where the city itself was responsible for demolishing some of these resources. Next slide, please. We also, of course, have some compelling stories that I think have helped just build some, not only build some trust, but also just surprise people with these sorts of histories. We, again, tend to think of Fort Collins as having a pretty quiet story in regard to civil rights. We tend to think, well, that stuff was happening in Denver. That didn't necessarily happen here, which is not the case. We had a small African-American community that was trying to build a Black church congregation. Charles and Mamie Birdwhistle, which you're seeing at their dinner table in the upper left there, and their home here in Fort Collins, that's still there on the bottom left. They were trying to kind of build a sense of community. They were trying to build an African Methodist Episcopal church here in Fort Collins. Were ultimately unsuccessful. But that's part of that story that actually extends throughout the first half of the 20th century. It's talking about community building and why it did or did not work. Our other story is a civil rights court case. Maddie Lyle, who's in the bottom center photograph, and she's bottom center in that, she went to the State Theater, which is one of our early movie theaters on College Avenue, our main drag through town. This was a theater, it's one of our first movie theaters. It also happened to be the site where our chapter of the Ku Klux Klan held rallies, meetings like that. She decided to attend a movie there in 1939. She was denied full accommodations, sued the theater, and won in county court. And so we have some of these compelling stories that have just surprised people in our own community. In Maddie Lyle's case, it's allowed us to build a relationship with her family that lives in Seattle now. And having this balance of acknowledging racism, but also calling attention to people who are pushing against that. That's been a really important part of getting people to support the efforts that we're doing and to be involved in it, especially when we're thinking about oral histories and the fact that our staff is completely white, is that we need other perspectives at the table, and to help get them to show up, we need to be able to tell a full spectrum of this experience. Next slide, please. And part of that, of course, deals with we're a college town. Colorado State University is here in Fort Collins. Part of that here is not just acknowledging that the university has attracted many of our Black residents and our Black families to Fort Collins, but also extends the story. There's also this idea that, well, racism happened a long time ago. When we look at our current situation with still a lot of de facto housing segregation, still a lot of lack of economic opportunity for both Black and Latinx members of our community, that's simply not the case. We know this history of racism and discrimination extends well into the present. And so that's been an important part of contextualizing this too, when we're talking about student activism primarily. From the university up through the 1960s and 70s, and talking about where it did and did not work, especially off campus, where there seemed to not be as much success addressing housing discrimination for Black students. That's been part of the story too, is acknowledging that we never really developed a good solution to this. And so again, a lot of this, you're probably hearing the same kind of story from me, is that we really needed to acknowledge this history and acknowledge that it's a very recent history regarding discrimination. And then next slide. And so for us, what this is created for us, where we have, we've got an executive leadership and a city council that's supporting our efforts on this kind of history telling and this kind of storytelling. And we need a rapid response because we have a very quickly moving code environment related to equity and related to housing equity in particular, is that we needed to create these rapid response histories that are responding to these kinds of stories, providing a context for those policy discussions. It's what we can do right now. And what we also found was that by doing these histories now, early in the process, and doing them in a way that acknowledges this uncomfortable history on a government website, where this is the city institution acknowledging this history, that's been a great way to get people involved and excited about these stories and getting them to the table, so that when we do that larger history project down the road, where we hire a historian who can do this with a fully fleshed out scholarly story, that we've got people on a steering committee. We've got people who can provide oral histories and can network with other community members. And so in this case, it's been a really good lesson learned for us about just about how to build trust in an environment where you do have support from your executive leadership, but don't necessarily have the other people at the table, the community members that need to be there to help tell the story. So we can go to the next slide. I think I've got a link on there down at the bottom. That's a link to our website where you'll find some of these histories. And then, of course, happy to answer questions when we get there. I think with that, I'll hand things over to Kate.
Thanks, Jim. I am Kate Scott. I am the Associate Historian at the U.S. Senate Historical Office. And our office serves as the institution's memory. It was created in the 1970s by the Senate to help document the Senate's evolution over time. And one of the ways that we do that is, we document these Senate's changes over time in a lot of different ways, including taking oral histories and doing our own research. Often some of the research that we do is precipitated by the need to recognize a commemoration, an upcoming centennial or bicentennial. And that is really the basis for my case study today. In 2016, we began to think in our office, as many historical associations did across the country, about how we wanted to commemorate the upcoming centennial of the Senate's passage of the Women's Suffrage Amendment, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. Our audience, as we began planning this, we were thinking, of course, of our audience. Our audience is primarily the Senate community, but more broadly, it's the general public. Much of the work that we do is presented online so that it can reach a national and international audience. We have very limited space in the Senate wing of the US Capitol to create physical curated exhibits. And so we tend to think of our exhibits, at least we have in the last 10 years or so, as born digital exhibits. And we design them that way. Typically what we can do when we dive into one of these research projects is that there will be other ways in which this information that we gather informs the work that we do around the Capitol. One of the ways is typically we develop this information and then we think about how we can reinterpret some of the spaces that we often visit on Senate tours of the Capitol, that we provide to senators, their guests, the Senate staff, and the broader community who come to visit the Capitol. I am having trouble, of course, advancing my slide. And does anyone have any idea why that might be? That's so annoying.
Kate, are you viewing it on the slide separately from the Zoom screen?
I am not. No, I didn't change anything about the way that I was using this or presenting this slideshow. So I don't know what's going on.
Kate, I've got it pulled up. I can try taking over the screen. And
yeah. Shall I stop share then? I'll stop share.
And Jim, I need to give you hosting rights.
Probably.
Okay. Right now.
I'm sorry about that. Thanks, Jim.
Not a virtual conference without some little.
Exactly. Okay. So as we began to think about how we wanted to present this work, we really thought about our office's 4 goals. The first is that we always tell the story through our institutional lens. The focus always has to be on the Senate and its community. And I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean about the Senate community in a moment. Of course, there's the senators themselves and their staff, but we had to think a little bit more broadly in this case, as we try to do whenever we do this type of research, about who is the Senate community. Second, we knew we were going to take a long chronological approach to telling this story. The anniversary that we were going to be recognizing was the 1919 anniversary, because that's when the Senate approved the amendment finally, after a decades-long struggle to do so. And then that Senate passage, along with the House, sent the amendment on the road to ratification with the state legislatures. So we wanted to think about all of the struggle that had come before that 1919 moment. We found that the first time the amendment had been presented on the Senate floor was in 1878. So we knew we had to go back at least that far, but we also wanted to recognize, importantly, that 1919 and then the ratification of the amendment in 1920 didn't solve all of the problems for all women. That state and federal laws continued to deny some women, African American women, Native American women, and Asian American women, the right to vote well into the mid 20th century. So we knew we were going to tell that story up through the Voting Rights Act, basically, of 1965. Third, we wanted, as we always do, to engage with current scholarship. And particularly, we wanted to ensure that we were demonstrating the roles that racism and sexism played in the long campaign to push this amendment through the United States Senate. Of course, we work in a political institution, and while we generally have the support of our executive team, which provides the final level of oversight for all of the work that we publish, we knew that some of these issues would be sensitive because we're having national conversations about these issues, about systemic racism and systemic sexism right now. So what we did, and what we typically do, frankly, for most of our exhibits, is that we let the members speak for themselves. We reviewed as many Senate speeches on the topic as we could, the ones that took place over 40 years of time, and we used those speeches, most of which were published in the Congressional Record, which is a government document, to explain how the members themselves were objecting to this proposal. Of course, we provided the context for those speeches, but it was the senator's own words that allowed people to understand the critical roles that racism and sexism played over this long struggle. Our fourth goal was always to incorporate overlooked actors and voices into these stories. So the challenge here is that during the long battle to pass the 19th Amendment through the United States Senate, not one single senator was a woman. So we had to recognize that the Senate was a largely white, largely male club during this whole period. And we didn't want women to serve as mere recipients in this story about the effort to pass the 19th Amendment through the Senate. So that's what I go back to that, our first goal when I said we try to look broadly at the Senate community. By looking broadly at the Senate community, of course, we can think about the role that lobbyists played. They were a constant presence over 40 years in the United States Capitol, demanding that senators pass this amendment. And those were all women lobbyists. So that was the way that we were able to incorporate those women as actors in this really important story. What did we do with all this information? Jim, you can go to the next slide. You can see here, this is our Senate website, and we publish these online, really text-heavy essays. I realize now, very text-heavy, but we tried to incorporate as many artifacts, typically document artifacts, and images and political cartoons that we could to illustrate this story. We also tried to sort of broaden our canvas by creating this longer chronology timeline, which you can see the last couple of entries on this timeline here. That I showed you just as an example. And it allows us, each of these sort of pops out a little bit and lets us tell a little bit more of the broader story. Sometimes we couldn't fit certain people in or certain characters in, and we were able to fit them into this timeline. The cool part was in June of 2019, which was the Senate's anniversary of the passage of this amendment, our exhibit took over the whole front page of US Senate.gov of the Senate website. We were really proud of that. we developed just a couple of other consequences that we didn't necessarily think about in the planning stage, but that we were really happy to develop as we went along. All of our research helped us really reinterpret some of the spaces in the US Capitol. And so we developed a walking tour that we led initially for senators and staff. And the Secretary of the Senate, who's our Chief Administrative Officer, accompanied us on the first of those tours. We felt like that was a really evidence of the strong community support we had for this effort. We also, of course, have done a lot of educational talks with external and internal audiences about this story. Finally, next slide, please, Jim. Finally, we created something that we didn't intend to create in 2016 when we planned this project, but we had all this material and there was a small space in the Capitol for physical exhibits. And so working with the curator's office, we sort of took some of the material from this bigger exhibit and put it into these panels that lined the first floor of the Senate wing of the US Capitol. Sadly for us, we mounted these in early 2020 and then we were displaced because of the pandemic. So I actually never saw them myself in the Capitol, which was sad. But also quite sadly, the exhibit was one of the casualties of the January 6th, 2021 insurrection. Those boarded up windows that you can see just above in this photo above those pillars, that's the west side of the Capitol where many of the insurrectionists broke through the windows and came through, and they just sort of trampled right over the project. It's 2021. We don't have any plans now to reinstall that exhibit. So that's kind of a sad end to a story that an effort that we were really quite proud of. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jean-Pierre.
Thank you, Kate. So I'm Jean-Pierre Morin. I'm the departmental historian for the extremely long-named Crown-Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada, which is the Canadian federal department that's responsible for dealing with the ongoing relationship with Canada's Indigenous peoples. Today, I'm going to talk about something a little bit different than everybody else, because ultimately, I'm going to be talking about what happens when politicians start meddling with our historical realities. Jim, if you would be so kind, just to go to the next slide. I only have 2 slides because I'm ill-prepared. But nonetheless, what I'm talking about today is basically what happens when a Canadian politician decides that a moment in Canadian history needs to be commemorated at the absolute highest level. And the event that I'm talking about is the War of 1812 bicentennial, which was from 2012 to 2015. For most people in North America, this is a somewhat secondary element. If you are from Baltimore, it was extremely big. If you are from other parts of North America, Canada, or the US, the War of 1812 commemoration was kind of like, meh, why actually do anything about it? In Canada, the drive to commemorate the War of 1812 came from one very, very specific and very, very important politician, the Prime Minister of Canada. This is the equivalent of the President of the United States deciding that he's going to commemorate something and directs the entire federal government to do something about it. Now, this came about largely as you can see here on the screen, there was a very clear statement as to what it was about. We wanted to promote Canada, increase Canada's knowledge on the War of 1812, present it as a key event in the creation of Canada. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's important to know that the War of 1812, for the Prime Minister, he saw it as a defining moment. For those who are not aware, as an aside, the debate about what the Canadian nation and Canadian identity is a never-ending, eternal debate about who is Canadian, what does it mean to be Canadian. All we know is that we're not American. This is the never-ending statement that we have. And the Prime Minister decided that the War of 1812 was that line in the sand that made the distinction between what was a Canadian and what was an American. basically, he is very much a proponent still to this day. He's no longer the prime minister, I will point out. He was very much his opinion that national identities are forged through conflict. And if anybody has ever spoken to Canadians about our national history, we don't tend to talk about our conflicts. We tend to view as Canada came about as the Great Consensus on the 1st of July, 1867, and that we never had to go to war. There was no internal conflict. We didn't have to overthrow the monarchy. We didn't have to throw out the British or anything like that. So we don't have that. For him, he really saw this as a gap, really, in our national identity, and he wanted to create a new myth that this was a fundamental element of Canada's identity building, that the War of 1812 created Canada, in quotes. The big issue with this is that the Canadian historical community pretty much entirely disagreed with him from beginning to end. There was very little of the Canadian of the greater historical community that actually believed that this was a foundational moment in Canada's identity. It may have been an important element in the history of central Canada, of Ontario and a little bit of Quebec, because really that's the only place where the conflict took place. It's along the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes and really nowhere else. We did go to Baltimore and to Washington, and then on the way back tried to get to Baltimore, but that's a different story. Ultimately, this commemoration is part of this very long series of commemoration called the Road to 2017. 2017 was the sesquicentennial of Canadian Confederation, the creation of Canada as a unified country instead of a bunch of separate British colonies. And this was really like the opening salvo, to use this military term, of the commemoration movement. There was to be commemorations from 2012 to 2017, about 5 solid years of never-ending commemorations. Everything from the centennial of the war, the centennial of the First World War, the 75th of the Second World War, Canadian female suffrage in Canada, the centennial of the National Hockey League, because we are Canada, and a whole bunch of other commemorations. This is all about this comes down to the very simple fact that commemorations are actually never about history. They are truly about politics. And in this case, it was how one specific individual decided that from a political standpoint, this is what we were going to do. We were going to commemorate this war, and it was going to be a launching pad going forward. Jim, if you would be so kind. Thank you. Now, the slogan for the War of 1812 commemoration was "The Fight for Canada." Now, if anybody knows anything about Canadian history, and you may have noticed from my previous statements that Canada came into being as a single country in 1867, talking about the War of 1812 as the fight for Canada is a little bit bizarre, because Canada does not exist in 1812, sorry. There are 2 colonies, the colony of Upper Canada, which is today Ontario, and Lower Canada, which is Quebec, which are called Canada in their title, but they're not unified. They're 2 separate independent colonies. The maritime provinces on the Atlantic coast are separate, independent. British Columbia on the West Coast does not exist. There's no such political entity, and there's literally nothing in between. So how can we truly be fighting for Canada? And when it came to this, the Prime Minister wanted to find sympathetic historians who would support his argument. And the Prime Minister's office worked with one of the departments to create an advisory panel of historians who would support his vision of the War of 1812. This is one of the more bizarre things, because they went across, they found the eminent historians of the period, people who worked on the War of 1812, people who worked for the Canadian Park Service at Parks Canada. I was part of this. And we had these initial meetings, and they wanted the committee to actually validate the historical context or the historical interpretation of the Prime Minister, that this was a fight of Canadians who participated in the conflict, that it was a conflict that created Canadian national identity, and that it was a vital element of repulsing the American invaders. And because of that, it set Canada on a very specific course by defeating the Americans. The entire committee of 12 historians told the Prime Minister's office, no, we cannot support this, and he promptly fired every single one of us. The entire committee that was chosen of eminent experts to work on to support the political arguments were summarily let go because we would not bend to the political will. What happened? We were all cut out of the political process. They went and found another group of historians who were not necessarily linked to the War of 1812 or the period, people who were much more of the Prime Minister's political leanings, and basically that became the guiding influence. So that meant that the traditional interpretations of the War of 1812 became the cornerstones of how the War of 1812 would be commemorated. The traditional way that the War of 1812 has been seen is that it's always been about the plucky Canadians defeating the great big huge and nasty Americans trying to invade us. We have British and French Canadians who come together to defeat together, the first unified moment of those two languages coming together to repulse them. We have some good First Nations, Indigenous peoples who are fighting along us, all encompassed by Tecumseh, the Shawnee chief. And we even have a participation of women with Laura Secord, who bravely trekked through 30 miles of wilderness to warn the Canadians, the British forces, that the Americans were crossing the Niagara River. All of this is reinforcing myth-making that wasn't necessarily true. And ultimately, my role in all of this was to try and push the Canadian administration to actually accept that Indigenous peoples, first off, played a larger role, but also to try and mold that argument as to how we're supposed to actually understand this interpretation. And ultimately, I was relatively successful. We managed to have a much broader commemoration that included specific elements of Indigenous representations. We had ceremonies with the Governor General, the Queen's representative in Canada. We had an issuance of medals and traditional flags, repetitions or recreations of traditional ceremonies. But really, the War of 1812 commemoration ended up being about basically American bashing, and less so about Canadian identity. I'm going to put in the chat a link to a video that was commissioned by the Government of Canada, which you cannot actually find on a Government of Canada site. Almost everything about the War of 1812 commemorations has been scrubbed from Canadian government websites because we have had a change of government, and most of those political ideas have been removed from our websites. The video itself was extremely expensive. The total budget, the total announced budget for the entire commemoration in Canada was roughly 50 million. This video itself is $3 million in and of itself. So a fair chunk of change in the broader budget. By the way, that 50 million is only what's reported. There's actually a much larger amount of money that was spent on the commemoration itself. The video is very bombastic, it's very Hollywoodish, and it's all about this idea of the struggle of Canadians against the American invaders. This is kind of a preposterous approach because ultimately, who won the War of 1812 is entirely debatable from a historian's perspective. We were joking about this before the session started. I think it's fair to say that we all know we can't necessarily say who won the War of 1812, but we can definitely say who lost the War of 1812, which are North America's Indigenous populations. And ultimately, how you deal with politics in a historical context is all about that political negotiation. How do you actually, how far can you go without having political masters intervene in how we actually do things? And ultimately, this has been one of the bigger challenges because the commemoration process continued for the next 5 years. This is just the first part. And even today, we continue to have national commemoration plans in Canada where we're trying to steer the ship, for lack of a better term, unless you're on the Suez Canal, where we're trying to ensure that we have common messaging around commemorations that fits largely the political messaging of the current government. And how we will go forward with this is part of the challenges. Commemorations in history, especially public history, are always going to be in conflict. But the debates around public interpretation, about public understanding of history, doesn't actually resonate well with politicians, which is why we have statues controversies, why we have our own controversies about commemorations here in Canada. I'm going to leave it at that because I could literally talk about the War of 1812 until the cows came home, and nobody really wants to put up with that. And I will turn it to Michael.
All right. Hello. My name is Michael Binder. My attribution says Principal Researcher, Mill Site Recon. That is what I used to do as an independent consultant. What I'm talking about today occurred during my time as a subcontractor to a prime contractor. In our description of the session, we talked about balancing historical truth and accuracy with expedience and coming up with creative solutions for maintaining academic integrity. I can tell you that in my case, there was no balance and there were no creative solutions. The title that I came up for my presentation was When Political Constraints Won and I Lost. Next slide, please. Before I go any further, I need to say that the views expressed are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of the Air Force, for whom I work, the Department of Defense, the US government, or even my fellow panelists, although maybe they will agree with me. The next slide, similar to what I have in other presentations, this is a gratuitous airplane photo of a nuclear-capable Douglas B-66 destroyer, which was deployed overseas in the late 1950s and early 1960s. It's one of my favorite airplanes. Maybe some of you will enjoy seeing it. That's my only photo. Next slide. My consulting snapshot. I became a Cold War historian around 1982. I've been at this for about 40 years. One of the reasons that I'm really interested in the Cold War is that it was largely fought on US territory as opposed to World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. And so my interest is in the built environment, and these are structures, properties, districts, sites that you can find on maps of the United States. In the period 1992 to 2001, after my time as a scientist, I worked as a consultant and as a subcontractor on some BRAC projects. The biggest one that I worked on was the closure of Griffiths Air Force Base in upstate New York, near Rome, New York, Fort Stanwix. My job was to assess the Cold War properties of Griffiths, doing a 106 because closing the base constituted a federal undertaking. Next slide. So I had to identify the significant Cold War properties at Griffiths. Now, Griffiths was a multivariate base. It hosted weapons systems for a multitude of missions. Offensive, it hosted B-52 bombers and KC-135 tankers. Defensive mission, it had fighter interceptors. It had a space tracking mission. The Deep Space Tracking System was located at an adjacent installation. It had command, control, communications, and intelligence missions. It had the Eastern Air Defense Sector blockhouse on its property. So eventually I selected 12 properties that had integrity, that were eligible to the National Register, that were significant Cold War installations, you might say. And this is 12 out of, let's say, 500 to 600 total structures on the base. So it's not a very large number. However, the prime contractor was not happy with that number of 12. They wanted to decrease the number because the more you have, the more money it's going to cost. And so in the end, the prime went with just 2 properties. One was a B-52 bomber on display, which was going to remain on the installation and was really not in anybody's way. And the other was that C-I Eastern Air Defense Sector building, which was going to remain in Air Force service. The other 10, which were all significant and to my mind, all eligible, were ignored. Last slide. So what was the fallout of this? Expedience defeated historical accuracy. I could not concur with the conclusions of the final report. So to maintain academic integrity, I had my name removed from the final report. I was asked, would you like to have your name removed because there were only going to be 2 properties instead of 12? And I said, yes, you need to remove my name. Perhaps more significant for me as an independent consultant was that I was dropped from consideration for a second BRAC project, which was going to be on another New York Air Force base that had ended up on the closure list in Plattsburgh, New York, which meant money not getting into my pocket. And the ultimate goal of the Section 106 process, which is to preserve our history, our national history, I'll use the term eviscerated instead of violated. That seems to be a more appropriate term. So that's my case study, and I hope I made up some time there.
Thank you all for some wonderful examples of the types of things that we're dealing with. I would like to invite the audience now to join in through the question and answer function. And on the screen here, we have 4 questions that are sort of general questions that we want you all to be thinking about and that our panel is going to be talking about. So think about these, put your questions into the chat if you want to share, into the question and answer. And if you want to share experiences, please feel free to do that as well. And we do already have one question that came in, so I'm going to pose that to Rebekah before
Christine,
the question.
Christine, before we go in, I just want to point out that no one can see us if they're on feed loop because the slide is taking up the entire screen. So for the last hour, they've been looking at orange screens and various pictures. And I just wonder if we may want to shut that down so that people can actually see us.
Yes, absolutely. I just wanted to have those questions out there for the audience to consider. So please take a quick look at those, and then we can take those down and allow you to see us face our faces, for better or worse.
And I will copy them into the chat.
Thank you. Rebekah, the question in the question and answer is, it says, great presentation. Was there any mitigation done as far as the visual or noise effects of the elevated expressway?
Thanks. What we were able to mitigate for those effects was only really the lighting on that elevated expressway. So instead of having, kind of what you typically see are those big mass lighting, the lighting was then attached to the railing, and the light bulbs were, those directional ones that really only were directionally lighting the road versus, having the light leak everywhere. There was really no way to hide that huge expressway as far as that visual impact. And there was really no way, because it was so high up in the air, to do anything about the noise contours and the ways that it went, which is why instead of being able to physically mitigate those impacts, we did that lighting impact, but then went with the actual history and public outreach interpretation as mitigation instead.
Great, thank you. And while we're waiting for other questions to come in, I have some questions to pose. And actually the first question, Rebekah, might be something you want to address as well. As we're talking today, it's becoming very clear that the processes that we use as government historians, and particularly the output, is different than what historians working out of the government are using and doing. And it's particularly different from that of academics. And I was wondering if you all could address how different it is and how that affects your processes and the way you're interacting with people.
Sure, I'd be happy to tackle that first. One of the big things that we have found, all of us at TxDOT that are cultural resource workers, the historians, the archaeologists, everyone, we all have at least master's degrees, and in many cases we have PhDs. So everyone has gone through really rigorous programs, done a lot of academic writing, and we're also really used to technical writing and writing in all this crazy jargon. And so we have a lot of trouble sometimes expressing our thoughts in normal people language. And so we've put some things into place, because if you want to tell your grandmother what you do, you don't want to be throwing out things like eligible for the National Register under Criterion A, adverse effect. Like, that means nothing to hardly anybody in this world. And so we have put some things in to make sure that we are actually doing public-based language. We try to write to an 8th grade reading level or less, which means no compound sentences, no words with multiple syllables. You know, we try to write in an active voice. So we always have an actor. We try to write short. We have word limits. So we try to impose word counts that help that, but still want to tell accurate things. So we always have citations. They may not be on the actual publication, but if anyone questions our stuff, we can tell them where we got this work. We always try to partner as appropriate with libraries or, you know, universities and things like that. It is a struggle for a lot of our staff. For us, for the archaeologists especially, their heart kind of hurts when we say dirt versus soil and things like that. But I had it all brought home to me one time when I was talking to a young girl at some outreach, and I used the word cattle, and she had no idea what it was. And it's just kind of like, you have to get it down to cow. She knows what a cow is. And it just kind of keeping that in the back of your head about how you can tell maybe your small child or your grandmother what you do, and how that's so different from academic and technical writing, but still be accurate in what you're saying. Christine, you're muted.
My apologies there. I wondered, Jean-Pierre, if this might be also a question you wanted to address, because you didn't really talk about it in your presentation, but I know a lot of the work that you do involves making policy recommendations, which is very different than what a lot of us historians are doing.
Yeah, so my unit, we're actually embedded in what was called a strategic policy directorate. So we actually do policy research. We do historic research that is designed to support a policy decision, how to come up with a new program, if you need to evaluate a program, if there's a crisis that's happening, what's the historical context that leads you right to the present day. So our needs are like the polar opposite. We are speaking to a highly specialized community that has its own personal language. Anybody who's ever had to deal with government, as Rebekah just described, it's its own crazy language of acronyms and other things. And we are always trying to fit that in. And part of the issue that we face is that most people who are policy makers or policy deciders, they're looking at the immediate. The crisis is happening now. We only need to know what's happening now. And from a historian's perspective, we're like, no, that's always the wrong approach. But when it comes to Indigenous issues, these are 200 to 300-year-old issues. We are dealing with the results of colonization, of assimilationist policies, of cultural genocide, of ongoing destruction of cultures and societies. So we need to place that within that context. A housing crisis is not actually a housing crisis. It's a relationship crisis, it's a funding crisis, it's all of these other things put together. So we need to be able to balance that. So it's about finding what is relevant. Showing up with a 500-page thesis of all of of a study means nothing to these people. You need to be able to condense it down into 2 or 3 pages of the only relevant material with 0 footnotes. There is no such thing as going and checking your sources. You have to write it in a way that will convince them, and that's it. And then it's about how you explain it. Citing the various historiographical debates that occur amongst issues is irrelevant, because for them, what is the answer? What do they need to do to solve the problem? And that's kind of how we have to approach things.
We actually have another question here. This is from Megan. Megan says, I'm a preservation planner in a city that has a long history of preservation, but has recently seen an influx of politicians that are openly hostile to preservation and seem intent on undermining the program. We've tried to educate both politicians and members of the community that support them on the importance of preservation and its benefits. However, this doesn't seem to be making any impact and have been forbidden from discussing their efforts with members of the public interested in preservation. I'm wondering if anyone has experienced issues like this in the past and how this was handled. And this actually gets at something that I know we've talked about within our internal planning is what are the ways as government historians that we are subject to oversight and in some cases even censored? So maybe Jim or Rebekah, since that was sort of aimed at you, do one of you want to start? Jim, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that's one of those challenges of historic preservation where you're not just talking about the history, the how you talk about the history, how you frame it. And Michael spoke to this a little bit with the base closures. Is there's supposed to be a decision that results from that. If you're saying that a historic place is significant enough to be preserved, to be kept around, if you're a government historian, usually if you're making that assessment, that's supposed to obligate a private property owner, an agency, operations manager, that depending on how the applicable laws are written, that might actually obligate them to do something, to spend money, to keep a building they were intending to demolish. Yeah, I think that's one of the things to understand is that, especially if you're a little bit newer to that. But I think, Christine, you had a really good example of what you can do in these situations. I think my own example from my time with the city of Aurora, east of Denver, was we had this shopping center that was on the west edge of town, right near the boundary between the city of Aurora and Denver. It was a remarkable mid-century modern building called Fanfare. It had these geodesic domes and everything, and it was just a beloved place, but it hadn't really been invested in for about 20 years, and it sat vacant. And our mayor at the time was just adamant, we're using our urban renewal authority, we're leveling this, and we're moving ahead. So in our case, we had a mandate in, and this is where it's important to go back to your code. So in our case, in city code, we had an enabling piece of our code that explained what our purpose was. And in that code, the determinant of what was a landmark and worthy of preservation was city council. So when city council said, nope, this doesn't count, that sort of closed that door. But similar to what Christine, you've done in New York, we just did our job elsewhere in the code, which was to educate our residents in the community about why this was an important piece of our commercial history, of our architectural history. So we were there when they kicked off demolition. There was a big, celebration from our urban renewal folks. And so we were just there with historic photographs. We provided some context and explained, this was important to Aurora's history. So I think in most cases, the very reason we have public history offices is to educate people about history. So in most cases, I think if you've been barred from actually using the code or your enabling legislation to take a specific action, usually you're still able to educate. Hopefully you have a nonprofit partner that can step in where you might have to be a little bit more measured in your language. We did not have that, so we basically just used historic photographs and said, well, here's what we're losing, goodbye. So that's kind of what worked in our case, was just at least documenting the moment and talking about the history.
Michael, I know you've said that you've been told to stay in your lane often. So in what ways do you find yourself sort of censored or prevented from speaking out?
Well, the kind of historian that I am is a lot different, I think, from most of the people on the panel. But what I have encountered is situations where, as a government employee, There are things that I can do and things that I can't do. And it's not going to be my choice. I need to stay in my lane. I need to be writing and speaking within the organization that I belong to and the higher level organizations that we're part of. But if I try to go outside of my organization, then I'm getting my hand slapped, you might say, and told not to do that. There's one thing I wanted to add about the differences between government and academic historians, especially in the Department of Defense. Each military service has a schoolhouse for turning out their historians. And just imagine if we had one university in the United States or one in Canada that produced all of the historians. What we try to do in the military is have conformity, and the people come out having had the same instruction, and they are given templates of how they're supposed to produce their histories. Now, some of them are veterans of academic history. They had careers as historians before coming to the military, but some of them haven't. And so they do bring some individuality, but they are still asked to stick to the format that is prescribed for the kinds of histories that they write. And that's very different, I think, from what happens in academia.
Thank you. You know, and this raises the question of the audience too, because we're all serving different audiences, you know, sometimes at the same time, in terms of, you know, sometimes we're addressing government officials, we're often addressing public. And Kate, I know this is something that you've had to deal with in developing some of your work. How do you think about who your audience is, and how do these different audiences, you know, change the stories that you're telling at different points in time?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it does change. I loved what Rebekah said about having these standards for language use, you know, the 8th grade reading level, the no compound sentences or words with too many syllables. That is just not what works in our shop. But I wish that we did more of that, to be perfectly honest. I wish that we did more of sort of a different kind of educational outreach. And we do, because we work very closely with the Capitol Visitor Center, which is Congress's museum. So we do have a role to play in talking about the history of the institution for different levels of learners. I think, though, our office mission, given what our office mission is, we always think of our primary audience as the members of the Senate community. So when we're structuring these these Born Digital exhibits, we're thinking very much about a senator, or more likely a member of their staff, reading these essays, maybe to prepare for a speech that the senator is going to make to recognize this commemoration. When we go on our tours, of course, we're using a different kind of language, and it's very much about trying to engage people in the space and thinking about interpreting that space in a certain way. So that's another kind of audience. Sometimes it's internal, but often it's just as often it's external. External being the general public. I mean, what I would like to say is, oh, wow, when we write those essays, they're hitting both the Senate community level and the general public level. And we just know that, I just know that that's not, it's not happening. I mean, look at those essays, they're really long. So just even in that case, they're too long, they're too text heavy. But I think that's because our mission is really to think about that Senate and the Senate community as our primary audience.
Thank you. Michael, I've got a comment for you in the discussion here from Gregory. He's saying that he's making some clarification about U.S. Navy historian training. He says that the Navy does not have a centralized historian training program like the Army and the Air Force. Navy historians are almost entirely academically trained prior to hire. Some are military or ex-military that obtain an academic training in history before being hired for the Navy's history program. So just a little bit of a clarification there.
I'll get Greg later.
So, one thing, Jean-Pierre brought this up earlier, the idea of relevance. And, most of us are working in agencies that aren't traditionally associated with history. And so, when we tell people that we are, working in government, people are surprised. And, in my own case, people within my own government don't always know I exist too. How do you make yourselves known and try to help people recognize your relevance? John? Yeah.
I can start with that. This has been an ongoing challenge for me my entire career. So I've just hit 22 years of service in my department. I'm in my 22nd year, and I've been basically doing the same job for 20 years. And rarely does a week go by that somebody doesn't say, wow, I didn't know we had a historian. Or wow, it's such a good thing that we have somebody to help us with these issues. And it always astounds me, because basically contrary to the United States, there's the federal government in Canada does not have departmental historians. There's only 3 federal departments that have historians. There's no law, there's no mandate, there's no requirements, there's none of that. So they kind of organically get created. And ultimately what I've started to do is that we've actually we're building a new knowledge transfer process. Basically anything that we do, we share. So we're breaking it down into different categories, the things that we can share that are linked to policy development, but some of which are classified as secret and we can't share, and the rest that's open to the public. We have like a speaker series that we manage. We work with the department, with the communications branch that manages the website portal to try and get them to change the content on a regular basis. And we also work with other institutions and other bodies to try and promote the amount of the history that we do. Just the task of trying to get it out, we're realizing, is a full-time job. And it's actually one of the most challenging things that we have, trying to make sure that people know that we're there. And once they see that we're there, they're like, oh, wait a minute, we need help with this. And it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You tell people that you're there, they go, oh wait, maybe you could help me with this. And it becomes, we keep demonstrating the relevance as we go forward. And in fact, I have to say, one of my colleagues she's completely indispensable. If she ever left, I'd be destroyed. I would not be able to do my job, because she's so effective at being able to push that information out, that we've actually realized that we don't have enough people. So now we're hiring more people to come in and help bolster the amount of work that we're generating, because people know that we're here.
And I'll riff off that. Or go ahead, Kate.
I was just going to mention that we have one question in our chat from Vanessa. Is it okay if I read it? I just wanted to jump in here if I can and make sure that we cover all these questions. Thanks to everyone for your presentation. She writes, for Rebekah and Jim, how do you handle other government agencies working against your efforts for fair historical representation? For example, El Paso's historic neighborhoods still struggle with preservation, specifically Duranguito and Lincoln Center at local and state levels. And she notes that Rebekah spoke about her project at El Paso Community College. Hi, Rebekah, she says.
Yeah, and I'll actually thank you, Kate, because I wanted to address that question from Vanessa. And I think it kind of relates to what Jean-Pierre was bringing up and Christine's question is, in our case in Fort Collins, I benefited. I've been with the office here for about 18 months. We've got a team of 3 people here. And one of the things that's been set up ahead of my arrival was a pretty strong relationship building within city government. And so whether it's our street engineers, our stormwater folks, other entities, our parks people, parks and open space staff, whether they're, when they're planning out projects, we have enough of an institutionalized relationship, and that's reinforced in our case with historic preservation, where we're dealing with built environment. We're just on the permitting process. We are part of our permit software just routes to us. So we engage in those conversations, and we try to keep those as teachable moments. We don't just talk about, yes, it's eligible, so here's what you have to do. We try to say why it's eligible and bring the storytelling component just to a staff meeting about what we're going to do with a stormwater project down a particular street. And because of that, we've built that same thing that Jean-Pierre was talking about of just an awareness that we're not just a checkbox, we're a resource. And so we get plenty of folks from other departments reaching out in advance. I think our rapid response projects about social equity have really helped with that, since that's a citywide mandate to address. And so specifically to Vanessa's question, I think that's part of why, at least in Fort Collins, we've not had other agencies pressing against our work. Sometimes that can, at least not in representing history. Sometimes when we declare this is an important piece of history, we should try to preserve it, that can run up against an engineer who wants to replace a bridge or something like that. And so, we can have issues over calling for the preservation of something. But I think just that advanced work of engaging people, showing that we're a resource has really helped. And in other historic preservation environments where that's not been the case, it's almost imperative that you have a nonprofit partner that can sort of force conversations where you don't necessarily have the authority as a government historian to just kind of jump in and say, no, we have to be here, unless you clearly have that authority. I think, having nonprofit partners that you engage with regularly that can jump in and advocate where a government historian can't necessarily advocate. I think that's a really helpful way to do that. And Rebekah, I don't know if you've got something to throw in there.
Well, we're coming up on our end of the session, right? Don't we end it? Well, to my time. I answered Vanessa in the answers of the chat, but basically we have another project coming up in El Paso that is going to run into the things that she said, and it's already started. The Fast and Furious anger has begun. So it'll be fun to see what happens, fun in quotes, to see what happens with this. Before we end, I wanted to promote really quickly the spring open meeting that the Committee for Government Historians is going to have. I put a link in the chats about where to go, but it will be on April the 19th at 11 o'clock Eastern. And we will have a link on how to get to this. We meet over Google Meet. We'll have a link on how to access this. I think it'll be posted on this Spring Open Committee's website, or you can always email me, let me know that you're interested in attending, and I can make sure that you get the link. So I hope maybe we'll see some of y'all in April too. If you're interested in potentially joining this committee, let us know that as well. You can private message me through FeedLoop, or you can find me I'm all over the internet. So find me on LinkedIn or whatever and let me know.
Thank you, Rebekah. And I just want to reiterate that this Government Historians Committee has been a great resource for me. And I know you could probably tell through our discussion today that we rely on each other a lot and like to chat about these different issues. So, our committee is here as a resource for you. So please do get involved. And I want to thank all of my fellow panelists here today for these wonderful presentations. I think we could have gone on and on for a lot longer with a lot more conversation about this. So let's say to be continued. And thank all of you who joined us today. So we hope to see you in the future and at next year's conference. So thank you all very much. Good to see you.